Heather mentioned, she and I last year went on the Church of England carbon literacy course. And then earlier this year, I ran the first one specifically for Birmingham Diocese, and all the Birmingham Diocese property team came on the course, as did a number of people across the diocese and beyond, and found it very helpful. But it is 3 2-hour sessions with bits of homework in between, and not everybody has the time to do that. So the idea of this presentation is that it tries to distill into 45 minutes or thereabouts the key contents of the carbon literacy course. And as Heather mentioned, this is the first outing of this presentation, so I will be very grateful for all feedback on it, either at the end of the session, or if you want to contact me separately, that's fine. At the end, I'll also be very happy to take questions, so you can either put them in the chat as we go along, though I'm not going to get a chance to look at them as I'm speaking, or we can just do it the usual way. You put your hand up at the end and we'll take questions. So, ready to launch. So, as most of you will know, in February 2020, the General Synod of the Church of England passed a major resolution. And they said that recognising that the global climate emergency is a crisis for God's creation and a fundamental injustice, and then they determined that we would seek to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2030. And so this presentation is to help us understand why the Church of England came to that conclusion, and have a better understanding of what we as churches and as individuals can do to be part of the solution to that crisis. But first of all, starting with a very much a layman's and a very short bit on the theology as to why we as Christians should be acting on the climate crisis. And the obvious starting point is that God created our world and the amazing interconnected web of life on it, of which we're part. And as we're seeing every day, it's been now knocked seriously out of kilter on our watch and as a result of our actions. And we only have to look at the parable of the stewards in Matthew 25 to understand God's attitude to bad stewards. And throughout the Bible, we see God's call to reflect his special care for the poor, the weak, and the vulnerable. And the climate crisis hits them worst and is doing so daily. And we're called to absolutely to pray, but also to act. You only have to think of the example of Jesus and the money changers in the temple. As Anglicans, our Christian calling is summed up in the 5 Anglican marks of mission that are up on the screen now. And the 5th one is the one that we most obviously associate with the climate crisis and climate action. But actually, as we'll see in a moment, it's also very much a justice issue. But in fact, creation care is threaded through every one of the marks, because if we really believe that we have a duty to preserve God's creation and don't do something, where's our credibility in mission and service? So let's now move on to the scientific facts. A lot of you will probably have seen, if not this slide, something very similar to it. It's a diagram demonstrating the greenhouse effect. Basically, sun's rays hit the Earth, some of them bounce back into space, but greenhouse gases in the atmosphere trap some of that heat. And up to a point, that's a very good thing, because if we had no greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the world would be too cold for us to live. But the more greenhouse gases we pour into the atmosphere, the hotter it gets, and it's like piling more and more blankets on the Earth. So what are these greenhouse gases? Well, I think everybody knows about carbon dioxide, which is the principal greenhouse gas. And a lot of people are also aware of methane, but not so many perhaps are aware of these other greenhouse gases. And though they're in smaller quantities in the atmosphere, they also are very important because of a combination of these two things: how long they last in the atmosphere and how powerful a greenhouse gas they are. Because you can see that carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. Methane, on the other hand, stays in the atmosphere as methane before converting to carbon dioxide for only about 12 years. But you can see that in terms of how powerful it is, over a period of 20 years, it's 72 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And that's both a problem, but also a potential solution, because if we cut methane, then that will have a faster effect on slowing climate change than just cutting carbon dioxide alone. But you can see these other ones are incredibly powerful, and we also need to be addressing those. So where are all these greenhouse gases coming from? What's the big difference between now and the pre-industrial age? Well, this slide shows it, and you can see the difference is our consumption of fossil fuels. And the graph shows that though our coal consumption is roughly leveling off, after a bit of a dip during the pandemic, both our oil and our gas consumption are still increasing. And what's that doing to the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere? This slide is a graphic of a very famous, it's called the Keeling curve, and it shows it maps the measurements that Charles Keeling has done continuously since before 1960 at his laboratory in Hawaii, measuring the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you can see from this slide both that the carbon dioxide concentration is going up and that the rate of increase of the carbon dioxide is increasing. This slide shows the same thing, the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but over a much longer time frame. We're looking at 800,000 years here. And what we can see from this is that over that time period, though carbon dioxide concentrations have gone up and down, they have never gone anywhere near as high as they currently are, nor have they sped up as anywhere near as fast as they have at the moment. And who's responsible for these carbon dioxide emissions? Well, mainly it's us, which brings us to the point of climate justice. And I've just got a couple of slides that hopefully demonstrate that. As Heather mentioned, we'll share these slides afterwards, so you'll have a chance to have a clearer look at them later. But the top left picture shows the world, the land masses as they actually are. The top right map shows that the world with the land masses distorted proportionate to the amount of greenhouse gases we are currently pumping into the atmosphere. And you can see from that that Britain is very much larger than its actual size. Then if you look at the bottom left map, that is distorted to show how much, what our cumulative greenhouse gas emissions have been since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And as we've seen from that earlier slide, just about all the carbon dioxide that's been emitted since the start of the Industrial Revolution is still in the atmosphere. And you can see from that that Britain is absolutely enormous. In fact, if you look at our cumulative emissions, we are the 5th largest carbon dioxide emitter in the world. And then the bottom right map shows proportionately the impact that different countries are suffering from climate change. And you can see that at the moment, we are comparatively suffering negligibly, whereas most of the developing world is already suffering enormously. So that's looking at it at a global level. What about individual carbon footprints? I was absolutely stunned when I came across these figures. They've calculated that in the period from birth to 18, a child in the developed world is responsible for over 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide. A child in Mali over the same period is responsible for less than 2 tons. So what's been the effect of all these greenhouse gases so far? Well, we're currently at somewhere between 1.1 and 1.2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And we're already seeing the effects of just that. The 8 warmest years on record have all been since 2015. And July, August and September of this year have been the hottest on record, and mainly by some distance. When a leading climate scientist was commenting on how much higher the September temperatures were over and above the previous highest, he used the highly technical term that it was gobsmackingly bananas. And these increased temperatures are causing and exacerbating weather extremes. Warmer air holds more water. And so you end up with droughts that in turn often lead to wildfires and flooding. I mean, we've already seen in Scotland and parts of England, but other parts of the world are seeing it writ much, much larger. So what do we need to do? Well, we do know. This is the findings from a report that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is all the world's leading climate scientists who advise the UN, and they produced a report in 2018, and they said that we really need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels to avoid a climate crisis, because as soon as we get above 1.5 degrees, it gets much more likely that we get to tipping points, which are points where, for example, the Amazon tips from rainforest to savanna, and we can't reverse that. We will reach 1.5 degrees somewhere between 2030 and 2050, depending on our emissions. And on current emissions, it's likely to be sooner rather than later. And if we want to keep to 1.5 degrees of warming, we need to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And in order to do that, we have to have halved our global emissions by 2030. But where are we potentially heading for? This is another slide from the IPCC report that shows the range of possible climate temperature increases between now and the end of the century. And they are hopeful that we will be towards the lower end of that scale. But on our current trajectory, we're looking at warming of 2.5 to 2.8 degrees. And we're already seeing that some governments are backtracking on the pledges that they have made. So why is that a problem? On an individual day, a couple of degrees warmer, it's just that bit more pleasant, isn't it? Well, unfortunately, on a global scale, it really doesn't work like that. And the next few slides hopefully demonstrate that. These are taken from a talk that was given by a science writer, Mark Lynas, based on his book. And he's the random guy who pops up in the top right-hand corner of a couple of the slides. So this is why we don't want to be even getting to 2 degrees. I won't talk to all the points on here, but you'll be able to look at them afterwards if you'd like. I'll just pick out a couple of these where they cause feedback loops, which is causing a vicious circle, that what happens makes it worse, and so on. The first one is the total of disappearance of Arctic sea ice in summer. And that's a problem because whereas ice reflects the sun's rays back out into space, open water absorbs it and so increases the heating. Likewise, the 6 million square kilometers of permafrost that are likely to melt. There are huge amounts of methane trapped in that permafrost. And as the permafrost melts, they will be released. And as we've seen, methane is an incredibly powerful greenhouse gas, increasing the warming and so melting more permafrost. What happens if we get to 3 degrees? Well, then we'll be looking at the melting of the majority of the glaciers in all the world's mountain regions. And that's a really big problem because that's where most of the world gets its fresh water from. We'll also be looking at deadly heat waves sweeping across a third of the world's land area. And by deadly, I mean exactly that. So-called wet bulb temperatures, which are a combination of heat and humidity, that means that a human being without access to artificial cooling will die within a few hours. We'll also be looking at major yield declines for staple food crops, with more famines and cross-border refugee flows at a scale that we've never seen before. And if, heaven forbid, we should get to 4 degrees of warming, then we'd be looking at the worst mass extinction since the dinosaurs. And shockingly, the usable farmland would migrate 1,000 kilometers towards the poles. And when you think of the billions of people who live in the equatorial and temperate regions, that will cause suffering and disruption like nothing we've seen. So that was the really bad news. The good news, as Professor Mike Berners-Lee puts it here, is that the solutions do exist. And the only thing stopping us solving this problem is us. So let's start looking at what the church can do and what we can do to be part of the solution. So why is the Church of England's net zero carbon target important? Well, first off, it is responsible, our buildings and transport are responsible for quite a lot of emissions, 410,000 tonnes estimated in 2021. But also, it is responding to our Christian calling to care for God's creation. And in doing so, it's providing a leadership role to church members and a leadership role to the wider community. And I've put this slide in about our vision for our buildings, because I think there can be a bit of a perception that aiming for net zero means hair shirt, that we're going to be huddling in cold churches. And that's not the vision that the church has at all. It's that our buildings will be warm, bright and welcoming, but that our transition to renewable energy and low or zero carbon technologies will result in us cutting our emissions to less than 10% of their current ones, and any ones that we can't get rid of, we will offset by verified schemes. So what's Birmingham Diocese doing? Well, it has prepared a net zero carbon action plan in outline this year, and that's being laid before Diocesan Synod in November. And then in December, they're going to put more meat on the bones. Early next year, they're going to put more meat on the bones and bring it to Synod then. And it's concentrating on gathering data so that we know exactly where we are and so that we can measure our progress towards net zero, communicating what we need to do and why, developing plans for what we need to do, and running pilot schemes that can then be rolled out more widely. They've already identified the top 20% of energy consuming churches in the diocese and offered support to them in developing net zero action plans. Birmingham Diocese was one of the first dioceses to achieve Bronze Eco Diocese Award, and we're working towards our Silver Award, and also supporting churches in engaging with Eco Church, in large part through the Deanery in Environment Champions and Parish Environment Contacts. But everybody has a role in this, particularly about spreading information about the urgent need for action and our Christian calling, in helping our churches to engage with and then progress through bronze, silver, and hopefully to gold Eco Church, but also helping our churches move towards net zero by 2030. I've put here a list of quick wins, which again you'll be able to have a look at after the presentation, but I just want to specifically mention one of them, which is the importance of every church completing their energy footprint tool return each year, and also communicating the results to the wider church congregation. And that's really important for two reasons. One is, if we don't know what our church carbon footprint is, it's very difficult to measure how we're doing in progressing towards net zero. But there is also a very distinct financial incentive, because I'll come in a couple of slides to the funding that the Church of England is starting to make available to help churches on the move to net zero. And if you want to be eligible for any of that funding, you have to have completed your EFT. So I would very much commend any of you who haven't seen this, the checklist that's been provided for the practical path to net zero. And one of the things that we can send out after this session is a link to this document if you haven't got it. And it sets out the possible actions that a church can take to reduce their carbon emissions. And it starts with relatively simple, quick wins that nearly every church can benefit from, and then moves on up the scale to more complex projects. And while some of those actions don't cost money and will even save money, most of them will cost at least something. But the good news is that there is funding out there, and there is more to come. Sorry, taking a slurp of water. Quite aside from the Church of England funding, there are community, environmental, and statutory funding grants available. And I've put on the slide a link to the Church of England website that has details of lots of webinars, but they are currently running a series of webinars about how to access these different sources of funding. But also there is money from the Church of England. The Church Commissioners have committed that between now and 2029, they will provide £190 million in funding. And the first tranche of this has now been made available, and it's 30 million, which has to be spent by the end of 2025. So what that's going to be on are demonstrator projects, where they're big projects where they will help a church towards their decarbonisation, and those will then be used as examples to help other churches around the country. And Birmingham has put in bids for the maximum that it's allowed on this first tranche, which is 3 projects, and we're waiting to hear on those. We've also been accepted onto a pilot for how to retrofit different types of clergy housing. So the audits of those houses are already happening at the moment, and the reports on what's going to be needed to be done on each of these are expected early in the new year. And very good news, we have got funding for 3 years for a net zero programme manager. And extra good news is that we know who that's going to be. He starts on the 1st of January next year, and he's Ben Smith, who's currently the Historic Churches Officer. And then, most importantly, for us more widely, there is going to be support for parishes. And we've been told that we will learn the exact time frame of when these are going to be made available in the next few weeks. And as soon as Heather and I know more about the timetable for this, we will let you know. So the funding that's being provided is a free energy audit for the 600 highest energy use churches across the country, along with small grants to help create action plans and kickstart initial green projects, subsidised energy audits for the next 1,000 highest emitters, support for trialling and evaluating new net zero technologies and solutions that again can be then rolled out across to other churches, a variety of different bits of support for schools, which is really important because actually church schools are responsible for nearly half of the Church of England, Birmingham's carbon emissions. And most relevant for individual churches is that there are going to be quick wins grants that will come out via the diocese for small scale works in churches, anything from LEDs to alternative heating solutions. So what I would say is be ready to apply when we know that money is going to be made available. So that's looking at our footprint as a church. For the rest of this session, I'm going to look at our personal carbon footprints. And you might say, well, yeah, but my personal carbon footprint is peanuts in the grand scale of things. And it's absolutely true that we need governments and businesses to act. But what we say and do really does have an impact, because our willingness to act on the climate crisis affects government attitudes and policies. You only have to look at the way our government has backtracked on net zero in the light of what they perceive to be the result of the Uxbridge by-election, to see what a big impact our attitudes or perceived attitudes have on government. They also impact business. You may wonder why there is a picture of all-purpose peat-free compost on this slide. That's because in my village, Sainsbury's sells compost. And I noticed that they were only selling peat-based compost. So I asked why they weren't at least selling peat-free compost as well. And they said, we don't make those decisions at this level. That's a board level decision. So I wrote to the chief executive, and his office came back to me and said, oh, yeah, okay, fair point. We'll look into it. And I don't suppose it was me. I think it was a combination of me and other people doing that. But upshot is my Sainsbury's only sells peat-free compost now. And then finally, our actions have an effect on the opinions and actions of other individuals. They have done studies that show that the thing that is the most effective at getting people to change what they do is seeing other people do that. After the session, with the other things that we'll send out, we'll also send a link to the WWF carbon footprint calculator. And if you haven't had a chance to do it before, I'd really recommend doing it, because it gives you a good feel for what we can do in our lives to cut our emissions. And this slide will give an indication of where you sit in that picture. Because in 2022, the UK average carbon footprint was 10.5 tonnes. If we were trying on a straight line basis to reduce our carbon footprint, then by 2022, we should really be at about 9.5 tonnes. The world average in 2018 was just over 6 tonnes. But if you were looking at fairly sharing out the carbon allocation for people across the world, then everybody's fair share allocation would be 1 tonne. So wherever we are on that spectrum, we've got progress we can make. And I think particularly us as Christians, we do need to think about what do we need to be content? Because it is our overconsumption that is affecting not just the climate, but also the environment. And the climate and ecological crises are intimately interconnected, and so are the solutions. So as the effects of the environmental effects of our overconsumption are that we're encroaching more and more into nature. We're destroying natural habitats, be that forests, mangroves, peatland, wetlands. And we're also degrading and polluting not only natural environments, but also our cultivated habitats through things like the overuse of fertilizers and plastic waste. And that in turn is making climate change much worse. You can see from this slide that God has given us these various natural means of regulating the carbon cycle. Soil absorbs a huge amount of carbon. Forests, wetlands, seagrass, mangroves, they all absorb carbon dioxide. But we seem hell-bent on destroying them. We're removing habitats and accelerating extinctions. And in so doing, we're accelerating the arrival of whatever the next COVID-19 is, the next zoonotic disease, the disease that jumps from animals to humans. And that becomes more likely because we're encroaching more and more into wildlife habitats, but also a warming climate favours small mammals, and they are the principal vectors of the jump from animal disease to human disease. So in a moment, I'll talk about the things we can actually do to cut our emissions. But I also want to mention the importance of talking and engaging, because it's absolutely crucial that we do this now in this critical decade where we've got to halve our carbon emissions. And it does make a difference. And particularly as we've got in the run up to COP28 and a general election next year. So talking to friends, family, neighbours, social groups, particularly engaging with your local MP and local councillors and with businesses that you deal with. And use your vote. Look at which party is actually advocating things that will ensure that our children and grandchildren have a livable planet and which aren't. And you're probably all maybe involved in some form of group, whether it's eco-church or local nature restoration or a campaign for climate justice. But what I would say is that in the midst of the often dispiriting news about the climate and ecological crises, working alongside people who are trying to be part of the solution really helps. So then on to what can we change? And we can change a lot of different things. And I will just talk in a little bit more detail about a few of them. And the first one is one that we don't necessarily think about, our money. And I don't just mean what we give to, which charities we give to, though that's important, or what products we buy, whether we're buying ethical products, so that's also very important. But just things like our bank accounts. You may think, well, there's not much in my bank account, but adding up everybody's bank account, the big banks are using that, and many of them to invest, and many of them are still investing in fossil fuel companies that are continuing to prospect for and mine for new fossil fuels. And I've put the Make My Money Matter link in there. They have a list of the goodies and the baddies on the environmental investment front, and the ones that but both they and Which, who've just done a recent report on this, say are the good ones, are the Co-op Bank, Triodos Bank, and Nationwide. And also your pension, if you've got a pension other than the state pension, and if it's one that's a money purchase one where you've got a pot, if it's not in an ethical fund, maybe think about moving to an ethical fund. But if it's a final salary one, then ask the trustees, what are they doing about climate risk investments? Then on to actual lifestyle things. This slide summarizes sort of single steps that we can take that actually make a very significant difference to our carbon footprint. And I'll come on particularly in a bit to the ones related to travel and our homes. So in our homes, a really easy step is to change to a properly green renewable electricity provider. Lots of electricity providers have a green tariff alongside their dirty tariffs, but comparatively few of them are really contributing to the renewable electricity growth that we need. But there are companies out there that do. Ecotricity, Good Energy, Octopus are three that particularly come to mind. Then ensuring proper insulation. The government's latest scheme, the Great British Insulation Scheme, is intended primarily for houses with low EPC ratings. But even without grants, things like roof insulation and cavity wall insulation pay for themselves within a couple of years. And when you're changing your central heating or your cooker, think about opting for an air source heat pump or an electric. And obviously just turning the thermostat down a notch makes a significant difference both to our bills and to our greenhouse gas emissions. We need to talk about food, because food production globally, everything from production to when we throw it away, is responsible for about a third of all emissions. And part of the problem is the amount we waste. You can see the figures here. And a lot of that happens once we've got it home from the shops. So a key thing is for all of us to try to eat everything we buy. But one thing that isn't on the slide, but which we also need to be looking to do, is wherever possible, avoiding buying air freighted goods. Mike Berners-Lee, in his book, How Bad Are Bananas? And spoiler alert, not bad, because they're sea freighted, not air freighted. Air freighted food can have a carbon footprint, in some cases, 100 times that of locally produced or sea freighted food. But there's no getting away from the fact that we do need to eat less meat and dairy, especially beef and lamb. And that's because, as this slide shows, though there's a big difference between beef reared on deforested Amazon land, for example, and pasture-fed homegrown beef, even the highest impact vegetable proteins still have a lower carbon footprint than the lowest impact animal ones. Now, that doesn't mean we need to go full vegan straight off the bat or anything like that. But just making a start makes a big difference. I didn't believe this when I read it, so I looked to see what the source was. But if everyone in this country cut out one red meat based meal a week, that would be equivalent to taking 16 million cars off the road. And you may have seen in the chat, there's some information from John, who has more information about a plant-based diet, and we can perhaps talk about that in the discussion at the end of this presentation. Clothes are another thing that we might not necessarily think particularly as having a climate impact, but the global fashion industry is responsible for about 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions and 20% of its wastewater. And basically, we all have way more clothes than we need. And we need to be thinking about buying fewer, buying better quality, repairing them, using them for longer. They suggest that we shouldn't be buying new unless we think we're going to get at least 30 wears out of it. And there are all sorts of different sources of great pre-loved clothes that we can get now. And then finally, a big part of all our carbon footprint is how we get around. And this slide shows the carbon footprint per person per kilometre. And we definitely should not be taking domestic flights unless it's unavoidable. And we need to be reducing our longer haul flights. But I was absolutely staggered at the impact of a large SUV. There was a report out last week that said that the average car in 2023 over its lifetime has a greater carbon footprint than the average car produced in 2013. And that's despite the growth of electric cars, which, as you can see, have a much smaller footprint. And that is simply because we are buying more and more SUVs. Now, on cars, obviously, the more people you have in the car, the less impact per person it has. So if we need to travel by car, then more people in the car makes a lot of sense. But as you can see, rail is a very good option. And I've put in Eurostar because that shows you what the impact is of having a very nearly fully green electric system. because France, their power system is mainly nuclear, and you can see that the carbon footprint of that is a fraction of the others. So I'll just finish off with a couple of things in terms of useful people to contact. On the things relating to your church and the net zero journey, the Birmingham property team are really useful, and I've put a number of the links in there. Then there's Reverend Patrick Gerard, who's the Bishop's advisor on the environment, and there's Heather, and there's me. And then finally, if you want to look into any of this in more detail, I will be running, don't know when at the moment, but will be running the full carbon literacy course again. But there's some really great books out there. If you want something short and inspiring, I would recommend Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac's book. They were the two architects of the Paris Agreement that first said that we would aim to keep global heating to 1.5 degrees. If you want more Christian perspective and a climate scientist, Katharine Hayhoe is your woman. Practical tips, Jen Gale, but also How Bad Are Bananas? That has the carbon footprint of everything from an email to a round the world flight, and it is quite an entertaining read. And if you want to look into the economics of how we build a world economic system that actually treats the planet with respect, then Kate Raworth's Donut Economics is very good. And I have copies of all of those if you'd like to borrow them. And finally, another plug for the Church of England's webinars. They've got things on absolutely everything from eco-church, progressing through that, to getting funding, to how good are heat pumps, all sorts of things like that. So that is the end, you will be pleased to hear.